Is Faith Talk 99.5. Find podcasts and contact information for all of our national and local ministries at our website, faithtalk995.com. This is Faith Talk 99.5. Revive Our Hearts is coming up in 30 minutes, but now it's Searching for the Truth, sponsored by West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock.
Welcome to Searching for the Truth, a live and local call-in program. Call in with your comments or questions now at 1-855-568-1062. That's 1-855-568-1062. Your friends at the West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas invite you to open your Bibles and study with us as Don McClain answers Bible questions with Bible answers in a search for the truth. This program is presented to you as part of the efforts of the West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock to search for all the truth presented in God's Word and teach that truth to men and women who, like us, are searching for the truth. Now, here's Don McClain.
And good afternoon. Welcome to Searching for the Truth. What a beautiful day it is here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I don't know what that was. You know what that was?
No, I don't.
Oh, well, good afternoon. It's, much better than yesterday. It's nice, sunny, does not feel like February. But thank you so much for tuning in. And, of course, as we always say, even with the weather being bad outside, it's a beautiful day. But with the weather great outside, it's a beautiful day. We are going to continue our discussion on what it means to live for Christ. And as we go through our study today, you are invited to participate. If you have a question or comment, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is 1-855-568-1062, 1-855-568-1062. And you are welcome to be a participant, not only a listener, but also have some input into what we discuss. If you have a question or comment, give us a call, 1-855-568-1062. You can listen to us live stream through KDIS 99.5 Faith Talks website. You can download the free app on your smartphone, and you can listen to us wherever you are. You can also, of course, go to our website at w65stchurchofchrist.org, and you can watch the live stream or listen to the live stream, whichever you prefer. You can also look us up on Facebook and follow along that way. You can watch us on Facebook. And James Hamilton, you're here with me again this afternoon, and it's certainly great to be here. Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Great. Well, yesterday we were talking about what it means to follow Christ from, a little bit of a negative standpoint, actually. We were talking about if you're doing these things, you're not following Christ. And we were looking in Galatians chapter 2, the second chapter of the book of Galatians, and we were noting the example of Peter. Of course, if you look there in the text, we're going to eventually get down to the passage that we're going to focus on, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Was Peter living for Christ when he was guilty of the things that Paul withstood him to the face for?
No, it was not Christ living in him at that point.
No, sure wasn't. He was being hypocritical. In fact, that's what Paul says there in verse 13. The rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. Peter was wrong. He was to be blamed. He was not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel. And so, as the Apostle Paul says in verse 18, for if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. Well, that's exactly what Peter had done. He had built again some things that he had destroyed, and he had made himself a transgressor. He was not living for Christ at this moment. So and James is joining me in this. We're looking at this occasion in Peter's life and some examples of living in a way in which it's clear and evident that we are not living for Jesus at this time. So, looking at the context, if you will, we can and do at some time, return allow our old self to creep back in.
Well, Peter, he's been known to give in to peer pressure, as he has in other cases. He was surrounded by people who were wanting to put Jesus to death, and when they said, "Oh, you're one of his disciples, aren't you?" He says, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And then he got worse and worse in his denials because of fear of people. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening here in Galatians 2.
Yeah, we had made the point that, Peter had at one time had these issues, but then he had changed after the resurrection of Christ. The day of Pentecost came. He made some evident changes. He had put those things to death at that moment.
Yeah, he was not afraid to die physically because he knew that if he was to be put to death for his faith, that he would be raised and he would have an eternal reward with Jesus. He knew that because he knew for a fact Jesus arose from the dead. He saw him himself.
Well, we pointed out yesterday that Peter had rebuilt partiality. And we pointed out also that if we are prejudiced in our treatment with others, of others, we are not living for Christ. We're not.
Well, Peter himself was not partial. He actually did associate with the Gentile Christians until some other people came and he felt the pressure to withdraw himself from the Gentile Christians. And so when people try to please other people or not offend other people, they're going to wind up in a conflict.
Right.
And we need to stand for what is right instead of, trying to favor one group's feelings over another group's feelings, because there will always be a conflict of feelings. Even within ourselves there often is, but certainly if we're trying to please everybody, we're going to wind up pleasing nobody.
That's right. Kind of like that soldier who was in the Confederate, or he was in the Civil War, and he wore gray trousers and a blue top and walked out on the battlefield and got shot from both sides.
Yeah. We just have to stand have to stand on principle. The principle of what is right. Mm-hmm. And the gospel requires us to associate with faithful Christians.
Yes, I pointed out, I think we both pointed out yesterday, that Peter, we're not saying that Peter did not have the right belief system. We're saying his actions demonstrated something else. That's why Paul called him a hypocrite.
Yeah, and actions speak louder than words.
Yes.
So his actions are condemning these Gentiles as being inferior in some way, and they're not as good as the Jews, and so his actions were preaching partiality.
And thus he was not living for Christ in that moment.
Right.
Let's look at something else, and this goes right along with what you were mentioning a moment ago, James, about being afraid of men. Verse 12, it says that he feared the circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He had not, or rephrase this, he had indeed heard that Jesus taught his disciples that you should not fear men, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. Do not fear a man who can take your physical life, but fear God. Matthew 10 and verse 28. That's a paraphrase of that statement. That's what Jesus says. Peter had heard that. Peter had asserted firm allegiance to Jesus. You go back to Luke 22, 54 through 62. He denies Jesus 3 times. You alluded to that a moment ago. What was his statement before he denied Jesus 3 times? I will never, never forsake you. Now, these other disciples might.
Even if the whole world stumble because of you, I will never. I'll die for you, he even said.
And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he demonstrated his allegiance with Jesus by pulling a sword, cut off Malchus's ear. He was ready to fight for Jesus.
Yeah.
But when Jesus surrendered, that, I think, demonstrates that Peter still had a misconception about Jesus' purpose and what Jesus was going to accomplish. Peter had a misconception, as did the other disciples. But he was willing to fight, but when Jesus surrendered, things seemed to just crumble for him.
And I do think it had to do with his misunderstanding of how everything was supposed to be and how it was supposed to work out.
They even had a misconception in Acts, the 1st chapter, I believe.
As far as the nature of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter denies Jesus 3 times after taking a stand, then he stumbled as he is put to the test in the courtyard as Jesus is being falsely charged with blasphemy. He's outside denying Jesus 3 times. But then he repents. In fact, he on the day of Pentecost, he's standing up before this great crowd, and he tells them that they were guilty of crucifying Jesus Christ, the one whom God has raised and made both Lord and Christ. You have crucified him. He pointed the finger squarely at them. Boldness is demonstrated in Acts the 4th chapter. He again demonstrates boldness, him and John both. He stands. They see the boldness. They could see it in him. They saw his boldness and knew that he had been with Jesus. And he made the point very clearly to them that we must obey God rather than men.
And those were the very same people he was afraid of just 2 months earlier.
Mm-hmm. Sure was. And, of course, now you jump into the future a little bit from Acts the 4th chapter. In fact, 10 years or so, give or take a couple. But it's sometime in the future. Now he's in Antioch. He's eating with Gentiles, but when these Judaizing brethren, they're Christians, by the way, they profess Christianity, they come to Antioch, what does he do? He fears them. He respects them more than he does doing what's right.
Right.
Well, we can be guilty, all of us can, of rebuilding things that we have once destroyed.
And it's not necessarily a selfish motive here. He's not wanting to make waves, you might say. But even if our intentions are good, if our behavior is not consistent with the truth of the gospel, as Paul said about Peter, then our actions are speaking something wrong and false, and we're going to cause people to stumble as well as endanger our own souls by sinning.
Well, Peter allowed fear to get the best of him in this instance. That's what Paul says about it. So let's make some applications of this. We're all going to face peer pressure.
Yep.
And when it comes to standing up for what's right, there will always be opposition. Always will be. It takes courage, does it not, to leave that which is false and do that which is right. Changing from who we have been takes courage. If we come to a knowledge of some truth that we have not known of, or we've been guilty of violating, and we're convicted of that, to make the change, there will always be a challenge before us. What about our family? We talked yesterday about prejudice, and before that, though, we were discussing the danger of trying to please other people. We're either going to be serving ourselves, living for others, or living for Christ. It's going to be one of those three things. And I made the point about family. Jesus said he came to bring a sword, and that he would cause division within people's own households. Does it take courage to stand up against your own family members when they are opposed to you accepting and obeying the truth?
Well, it takes a lot more courage to stand up within a family than it does complete stranger. You go door knocking and you preach the gospel to them, you offer it to them, and they either take it or leave it, and you haven't lost a friend if they reject you. That's easier to take than the rejection of a family member.
Sure it is.
And there can be a real loss of a long-time relationship.
I think this is one of the hardest things that people do have to overcome when maybe they've been in denominationalism, and to accept the truth. That's going to cause it's going to cause a problem. There's no way around it.
There were a lot in Romania that had experienced that.
Right. You come out of Catholicism to accept the truth. That means that if your family is all Catholic, how's that going to affect your relationship?
Well, in the villages, the entire village would reject you.
Yeah.
A lot of times. because they were overwhelmingly of one religion.
Here we have two people primarily in Galatians chapter 2. Of course, Barnabas would be another, and then, of course, the other Jews, but let's focus primarily on Peter and Paul. Both of these men were raised Jewish, the Hebrew religion. The Apostle Paul especially, he said that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Paul was brought up in a home, I think it's inferred, that he was brought up in a home that was very strict. He was sent to learn from one of the most renowned Jewish teachers that there was.
The top Pharisee.
Gamaliel. He was at the top.
Yep.
Paul was brought up in that. He was being groomed to have a prominent place in the Jewish leadership.
Yeah.
And Paul had to make a choice. When he became a Christian, no doubt he left family behind. No doubt he left friends behind. It took a lot of courage for him to stand for the truth. After he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, he was converted.
You wonder about the other people that traveled with him, because there were people that traveled with him. Did they change? We don't know. But Paul stood for the truth, and I think even family members, if you stand firm on principle, they will at least respect it, even if they continue to disagree or give you a hard time.
Mm-hmm. But too many times it causes a rift in the family that it breaks the relationship completely apart. And I've seen it personally. I know people who have had to make that hard choice. But it takes courage to do that. Do we love the Lord enough, and are we determined to live for Him to the point that may even destroy our earthly relationships with our family, our friends? It takes strong convictions to do that, doesn't it? And here Peter made a choice. He sided with the circumcision in this case, at least externally. Well, it takes courage to stand for the truth and to oppose error. It took courage for Paul to stand up before them all and accuse him to his face, point it out before everybody that he was being inconsistent and wrong in what he was doing.
Yeah, because even Barnabas was going along with what Peter was doing.
Right here in this very context, we see a stark contrast between Peter and Paul. Doesn't mean that Paul is a better person per se, just in this instance and in this setting. Paul did set the example that we ought to follow. Peter did not. Peter made a mistake. We all do that, right? So let's not say, well, Paul is just some super Christian. No, they're both. But Paul, I think, made mistakes too along the way. No question about that. But and by the way, inspired men did make mistakes. Here's an example of an inspired man committing sin. He needed to be rebuked for it. Paul rebuked him. So, it takes courage to stand for the truth and oppose error. Peter failed in this moment. It takes courage to preach the gospel to the lost. It takes courage to live for the Lord in an ungodly world, and we certainly live in an ungodly world. And to impose our friends who practice error or who want to influence us to join them in unauthorized practices, it takes real strength to stand up for what's right. It takes courage. So it's so easy to succumb to, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Peer pressure is not an easy thing to overcome. So another thing is, here's a result now from Peter's sin. Who did he lead away with him in this hypocrisy?
Oh, it specifically mentions Barnabas being carried away with it as well as Peter, which meant Paul was by himself, I believe. Barnabas, if we see anything in Scripture about him, he got the name he got because he was a people person who loved everybody and sought to encourage everybody, but his actions going along with Peter would discourage the Gentile Christians.
Absolutely. And Barnabas was a strong Christian. I'd consider him a strong Christian at this time.
Yeah, and he was one who understood the importance of fellowship enough to where he stood up for Paul when he first became a Christian. Actually, it's 3 years at least he was a Christian.
He had demonstrated great strength and positive influence in his life. But now he's being led away with Peter. And again, you made the point earlier, and I agree with you. Peter's problem was not that he truly believed what he was practicing. He was simply playing the hypocrite at this moment. Mm-hmm. And Barnabas and other Jews were carried away with this. And I think we can see in this the power of influence.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
We need to realize that, someone is always watching us. We're going to set an example, regardless of what we do. And there will be someone following along in that example. So we must always be conscious of that. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 13 through 16, you are the salt of the earth. He also said, you are the light of the world. Jesus is then in that statement talking about our influence. And if we are living for Jesus, then what kind of influence will we be having on those around us?
Well, it has to be something noticeable if it's going to be light in a dark world, and that was the boldness that Peter had with John in Acts 4. Mm-hmm. They saw the boldness of Peter and John and noted that they had been with Jesus.
Good point. So, now there's a real danger in negative influence. There's also great advantage and need for positive influence. Well, if we're following Jesus, that's the only way we can be a positive influence. By the way, the idea of being the light of the world, ye are the light of the world. It's not that we in and of ourselves are that light. It's that Jesus' light is being effused or coming through us. It's through him. He is the light, and if we're living and walking in the light, then we too will be influencing others in the same way.
Like 2 Corinthians 3, by our presence, beholding the glory of the Lord, He is the source of light, and then we reflect that.
Yes, that is a real good passage to compare that with. But the danger of following men, even normally good and respectable men. Peter was an apostle of Jesus Christ, and here he used or abused, I should say, or misused his person, his reputation, and led other people into that which was wrong. So the question, I guess, that we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of influence are we having on those around us? If we're living for Jesus, then what kind of influence will we have? If we are not living for Jesus, we cannot influence them for good. We can't.
Yeah, and a failure to make an effort to influence others, that itself sends a message. That itself becomes an example people will either follow or stumble because of how we fail to lead or influence others as we ought to. And so it's like the tree that does not bear any fruit. That's what we're trying to be, not influencing anybody. Right. Absolve ourselves of responsibility. It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way.
The tree that does not bear fruit, whether it's if it does not bear good fruit, so it can be bearing bad fruit or it can be bearing no fruit at all, it's going to be cut down, burned in the fire. So
looking at Peter and his example, who was he living for in this moment? Well, he wasn't living for Christ, not at this moment. I do believe that Peter changed. He repented after this because he references the Apostle Paul later in 2 Peter chapter 3 as his beloved brother who wrote Scripture, who wrote of the things of the hope of Christians everywhere, and he pointed to Paul as one who had authority. So I don't question Peter's return back, and I'm saying he made a mistake right here in this instant, and it hurt his influence. And the Apostle Paul himself in this moment said that Peter's actions were not in keeping with the gospel. He gave credence and he gave legitimacy to false teachers. And in doing so, he built again that which he had once destroyed. He'd become, as Paul, these are Paul's words, he'd become a transgressor. And of course, sin separates us from God. So, Lord willing, tomorrow afternoon, we're going to get really to the point. Living for Christ and what is necessary for us to do that. Till then, may God bless you. Hope you have a great
Church
rest
of Christ
of the day.
that meets at 7115 West 65th Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, has presented this program in the interest of searching for the truth. To request a past program, religious discussion, sermon CD, or religious literature, call 501-568-1062. That's 501-568-1062. You can email Don McClain by going to the church's website at www.w65stchurchofchrist.org. That's www.w65stchurchofchrist.org. If you'd prefer to write to the West 65th Street Church of Christ, the address is P.O. Box 190062, Little Rock, Arkansas 72219. Please join us this Sunday morning for Bible study at 9 a.m. and worship at 10 a.m. Sunday evening worship begins at 5 p.m. We also have a Wednesday evening Bible study at 7 p.m. You are welcome at any and all of these services. Tell your friends to tune in each weekday afternoon starting at 3 o'clock to Searching for the Truth on Faith Talk 99.5 FM, where we hope our efforts will help you as you search for the truth.